One question which I have asked repeatedly in this series is, what is horror? The answer, of course, is, it depends. In the 1920s, the last decade of continuous silent film production, you'd be forgiven to assume horror films were all about pure visual terror, and that the majority of horror films were monstrous escapades like those seen in Nosferatu and The Golem. You would be wrong. With a few notable exceptions, the horror films of the 1920s did not explore the supernatural, nor did they feature gratuitous violence and sex, though again, there were exceptions. But this episode of History of Horror isn't about those exceptions. It is about the films that focused on man as monster, and honestly, that is the vast majority of 1920s horror cinema. Besides, most films that towed the line with sex and violence and monstrous creatures found themselves censored or edited, like this film, The Monster of Frankenstein from 1920. Most of the macabre scenes featuring the monster were cut by Italian censors that left precious little for horror audiences to enjoy. The film soon vanished. No copies are known to survive. The standard for what filmmakers could show was tamer back then. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't that people were more naive. Life in the 1920s was not a hunky-dory happy place where sex and violence were absent from the public consciousness. Remember, these people had just endured the new invention of power-hungry minds, the World War. And the specter of tuberculosis and other deadly ailments hung over people's heads every day. Life was not a Gatsby-like party. And the Roaring Twenties was marred by sex and violence scandals, including the one where poor Fatty Arbuckle was wrongfully accused of rape. Despite being proven entirely innocent, the media went after Arbuckle for sport and sales. It was a cruel decade in many ways. Which perhaps explains why so many of the so-called Hollywood horror films of this era were either melodramas about vengeance, sin, and debauchery, or they were internalized dramas about the evil that men do. A common theme across most horror films from this time was personal sin and moral corruption. The films pitted characters against temptation, or their own sinful ways, and punished them with emotional breakdowns, or had them rage at the world. With a few exceptions like Nosferatu and The Golem, most horror films from this era were not monster movies. Those came later in the 1930s, when a certain vampire count changed the production narrative of film producers, making the supernatural a go-to topic among filmmakers. When we did meet monsters in 1920s cinema, these monsters belonged more in the realm of fantasy and science fiction. I'd argue that the 1920s was far more interested in the horrors of men. Released at the start of the decade, one of the most powerful horror films of the era is the ghost story Korkarlen, known in the English-speaking world as The Phantom Carriage. The Swedish film was an adaptation of author Selma Lagerlöf's story about the redemption of a violent alcoholic. The film follows a man whose drinking causes grief and hardship for his wife and children, even to the point of severe domestic abuse. When the man dies at the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve, he is condemned to drive the coach of death for the next year, collecting all the souls passing away during the next 12 months. Time slows to allow him to collect them all, and the punishment feels like eternal damnation. The film, masterfully directed by Victor Sjöström, used innovative storytelling techniques like flashbacks, playing with time, and telling a story within a story. In addition to inspiring other filmmakers to adopt these techniques, the film also has been homaged in later milestone horror pictures, such as The Shining. Seen today, Korkarlen is primarily recognized as a fantasy drama. Victor Sjöström, who later emigrated to Hollywood, where he made beautiful silent dramas such as The Wind and He Who Gets Slapped, is today known as a dramatic filmmaker. But so is Stanley Kubrick, and nobody would deny that The Shining is horror cinema at its most pure. I think the same goes for Korkarlen. The film is certainly dramatic and sad, but who says horror films can't be? It is a story about human darkness and the costs of monstrous behavior, inner demons, and neglect. Seen with the eyes of 1920s audiences, who, remember, had just endured years of heartache and the extermination of a generation of young men, For them, this film was absolutely horrifying. And like some of the finest tales of horror cinema, it is an emotional gut punch. Cinema was such a new medium that many of the filmmaking tropes we take for granted were being invented on the fly by filmmakers trying to figure out how to most effectively tell their story. Korkarlen was one of these inventive pictures, and it helped further much of the visual horror language. That same year, the first of the decade, also saw another landmark horror film, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, starring John Barrymore and directed by John Robertson. While the story had been filmed 3 times before, this was the first feature-length adaptation, and the filmmakers approached Robert Louis Stevenson's novella with genuine artistic ambition. Their dedication paid off, and the movie was a smash hit. It was also, in fact, one of 3 feature-length adaptations released in 1920. The other 2 films have made less of a historical impact, but let's take a closer look at them anyway. With the same title, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, starring Sheldon Lewis and directed by J. Charles Hayden, is today forgotten. The story took place in contemporary 1920s New York. At the end of this version of the tale, it all turns out to have been a dream, with Dr. Jekyll waking up and deciding not to pursue his research. The film is extant, but hard to find. The third 1920s adaptation, The Head of Janus from director F.W. Murnau and starring Conrad Veidt, is today a lost film. A few stills that survive promise a fascinating early expressionist film, but we cannot know how effective it was. Considering Murnau would go on to make Nosferatu only a year later, I'm betting its impact on cinema was significant. Anyway, the one thing these 3 films had in common, other than their source material, was that they were films that dealt with the evil lurking within men. The John Barrymore version was a melodramatic psychological drama, and the thesis is quite literally that the evil is within man himself. Not an unexpected conclusion, really, considering the recent invention of industrialized warfare. Another landmark horror film released in 1920 was The Penalty. We cannot have a discussion of horror films in the 1920s without studying the genre's preeminent star, the man of 1,000 faces, Lon Chaney. If we, perhaps somewhat arbitrarily, divide horror cinema in the 1920s into 3 categories, they would be 1. German expressionist horror, 2. Haunted house comedies, and 3. Lon Chaney films. Lon Chaney's The Penalty is the first film in his filmography that is considered horror, yet plot-wise, it is a melodrama about a vengeful cripple who rises to the top of the San Francisco criminal underworld, all in a bid to take revenge on the surgeon who maimed him, and on society at large. It doesn't take a big leap to compare the crippled Chaney to all the crippled and soon-to-be forgotten men who returned from the battlefields of World War I. The climax of The Penalty has Chaney undergo an operation, after which he realizes there is good in the world, giving him a reason to change for the better. This is melodrama at its finest. It is also horror, certainly not by today's standards, but in the 1920s, this maimed, handicapped, angry anti-hero captured the darkened spirit of society, with Lon Chaney reflecting it in a twisted and macabre performance. Chaney again played deformed anti-heroes in 2 of the most famous horror films of the decade. Taking a closer look, The Hunchback of Notre Dame is certainly historical melodrama, but less so horror. In fact, Victor Hugo's source novel isn't called The Hunchback of Notre Dame in its original French. It is called Notre Dame de Paris, which literally translates into Our Lady of Paris. It is a dramatic novel following several characters, but I'd argue the primary narrative focus is just as much on the inner turmoil of Archdeacon Claude Frollo as it is about the hunchback Quasimodo. In film adaptations, Frollo is usually shoved to the background and depicted as a villain tormenting his ward Quasimodo and female lead Esmeralda. But the source novel has a much more sprawling narrative, and the hunchback can't be said to be the only lead character. Quasimodo's heartache comes from his exterior looks, while Frollo's come from his inner demons. Films are, of course, a more visual and less contemplative medium than novels, and with Lon Chaney playing Quasimodo, it is hard to focus on anything but him. Despite much of 1920s horror cinema looking internally by having the inner nature of characters pantomimed and brought to the surface, in this film, I feel like the masterful makeup actually draws us to the exterior. This doesn't mean the film is bad. It isn't. It just means it is a different type of film than most 1920s horror films. And it is perhaps less a horror film for this reason, and more a historical drama. More within the bounds of genuine horror cinema, we find The Phantom of the Opera, where Lon Chaney's freakish phantom is a man tormented by his own deformity. Like in The Penalty, Chaney here plays a man who rages at the world. This scene was one of the earliest true shock effects in horror cinema. Things have escalated from here, but this was the jumping off point. Common to both Hunchback and Phantom is that they deal with the grotesque side of humanity, studying what happens to people who are dealt a raw deal by the world. They both fit into the thesis of this video essay, which is that American horror cinema in the 1920s was primarily about the horror within man himself. Lon Chaney would act in 6 more horror films before the decade was over. All of them fall within the standards of 1920s horror tropes, but none of them are outright horror films in a modern sense. Let's take a quick look at them, starting with The Monster. Remembering the 3 ways I divided films, expressionist cinema and haunted house comedies and Lon Chaney films, this 1925 film would fall into the Lon Chaney category and the comedic haunted house category. Though of course there are no ghosts, but rather madmen that haunt the house, chasing the hapless hero around, threatening to perform mad experiments on him. The film hasn't aged well, not when compared to other Lon Chaney films, or other haunted house comedies like The Cat and the Canary, but it's still worth a look if, like me, you're a fan of Chaney. But I suspect some will be confused by the lack of actual monsters in a film called The Monster. The bad guys are all human, but hey, that fits into the thesis I'm running with, so yay, I guess. On to the next one. The Unholy 3 was a crime movie with a killer gorilla, which, by the way, was a common horror subgenre in the 1920s and later. Perhaps I should have made it the 4th type of 1920s horror film, but I haven't been able to see most of these early gorilla films, and I'm thus unable to give an informed opinion. Sadly, several of the 1920s killer gorilla flicks are today lost, and those that remain are hard to find, forever locked away in film archives. But, focusing on The Unholy 3, the film is about humans doing bad things to each other. The gorilla is just, well, a photographically enlarged chimp, sparingly used by director Todd Browning whenever the plot needs a bit of animalistic violence. Delving deeper into Lon Chaney's horror cinema, The Unknown, Where East is East, and West of Zanzibar were all melodramas about possessive and vengeful men, whose lust for revenge ends up backfiring spectacularly on them. The Unknown featured an outlandish plot about a criminal getting an amputation to seduce a woman who can't stand the touch of men, only to have her fall in love with someone else. Where East is East featured a man protecting his naive daughter from her wicked mother, who's trying to seduce the daughter's fiancé. And, oh hey there's a gorilla in it too. If you think the Dragon Lady stereotype of Where East is troublesome, just wait until you get a look at West of Zanzibar, where Lon Chaney bamboozles a group of African natives with his magic tricks. West of Zanzibar is a particularly sleazy and lurid example of 1920s horror, and it is perhaps also one of the best horror films Lon Chaney made. In this jungle tale, Lon Chaney tortures the daughter of the man who stole away his wife 2 decades earlier, only to discover in the end that the girl he's been torturing is actually his own child. If you can stomach the film's racist depictions of African natives, West of Zanzibar is a particularly well-made and acted example of 1920s American horror cinema. It embodies all the themes so common to the horror genre of the decade, including a character struggling with his inner demons, and the monumental cost of those demons upon all the people in his life. That leaves us with one last Lon Chaney horror movie to look at. It is perhaps the most famous horror movie he ever made, outside of Phantom of the Opera and Hunchback of Notre Dame. It is also a film I can guarantee you haven't seen. London After Midnight remains the most sought-after lost film in cinema history. Without a known copy to watch, the film is known primarily for Chaney's vampire makeup, an image that has endured time. The last known print of London After Midnight went up in flames in the 1967 Vault fire at MGM Studios. So today, the closest we can get to see it is by watching the still image reconstruction supervised by Rick Schmidlin. So why is London After Midnight the holy grail of lost films? The most likely reason was Lon Chaney, who was a masterful actor. The iconic image of him as a vampire, and the fact that he was in the running to play Dracula, but died before he could take the part, all likely had something to do with it. By all accounts, London After Midnight wasn't a very good film. Naturally, I hope somebody stumbles upon a print and proves me wrong, but the chances of that happening are slim to none. However, director Todd Browning remade this film in 1935 as Mark of the Vampire, starring Bela Lugosi in the Lon Chaney part. Plot-wise, the story is nearly identical. Mark of the Vampire is a pretty dated and uninspiring film, which indicates London After Midnight might be a great disappointment if rediscovered. What Mark of the Vampire does tell us is that London After Midnight belongs in the haunted house comedy style of films. It features a murder mystery, a haunting, in this case by vampires, and in the end, it all turns out to be a hoax, with no actual monster. Lon Chaney was simply a police detective masquerading as a supernatural creature in order to discover clues. Such plot tropes reappear in practically every film in this subgenre. It is always a man and never an actual monster. The most famous example of the 1920s haunted house spoof genre is The Cat and the Canary. Several characters are gathered at a house when things begin to go bump in the night, and a monster stalks the corridors. There is, of course, no real monster, but rather a man dressed up committing evil deeds for financial gain. Thus, while this subgenre lacks the serious melodramatic tone of most 1920s horror films, they do fit with the concept that men are the real monsters. Similar endings were also used in haunted house films like The Terror, which is sadly today lost, Seven Footprints to Satan, and D.W. Griffith's One Exciting Night, one of the earliest examples of the haunted house spoof genre.
I am Dracula.
Like I mentioned earlier, American monsters first became supernatural with Dracula, and when that was a hit, the floodgates opened. Suddenly everything was a true monster and not actually men. Let's skip back across the pond and look at German horror cinema in the 1920s. These films were more inspired by fantasy elements than their American cousins, but they still primarily focused on human characters. Nosferatu and The Golem were classic monster movies, and thus exceptions, but The Hand of Orlac, made in Austria, and The Student of Prague both dealt with temptations of men. In The Hands of Orlac, a pianist has his hands severed in an accident, but is lucky enough to have a new pair of hands transplanted. They, of course, belong to a killer, and once our hero figures that out, he begins to feel an overwhelming urge to continue the work of the previous owner of the hands. The Student of Prague is a classic Faustian tale about a poor student who sells his mirror image to a mysterious stranger, only to see said mirror image run amok around town committing crimes. When he confronts his image, shooting it, he kills himself. Both films play on similar story tropes found in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and for that matter in Oscar Wilde's novel The Picture of Dorian Gray. So why is that? Why did the horror cinema of the 1920s focus so much on the internal nature of men, rather than the external threat of monsters? Perhaps the answer lies in the development of psychoanalysis. The term was coined by Sigmund Freud in 1896, only a year after the invention of cinema. Thus, film and psychiatry were born almost at the same time. It is no surprise then that the theories developed by Freud and further developed by his students, such as Carl Gustav Jung, ended up influencing the new art form of cinema. Cinema was made to interpret the inner state of man visually, and with the 1920s being a decade of silent filmmaking, the inner state of turmoil had to be acted out in pantomime rather than spoken in dialogue. This helped steer filmmakers in the direction of visualizing internal conflict in their narratives, rather than focusing purely on external monsters. Sound and dialogue actually helped effectively portray the external threat, and monster movies in the 1930s benefited from the addition of sound. Mind you, I'm not saying that horror cinema in the sound era was less psychologically complex, just that silent cinema was uniquely qualified to visualize psychological torment as theorized by Freud and Jung and others. I'm also saying that pantomime is a form of acting that specifically conveys emotion and inner turmoil visually, instead of relying on line readings.
I'll show you who I am and what I am.
I think that dialogue, once introduced, steered the focus of horror films in another direction, one dominated by external narratives and external threats such as supernatural monsters. That being said, those monsters were a visual representation of psychological ideas in their own way, but that, I think, should be explored in later episodes. Let's go full circle and return to Swedish horror cinema for the end of this video essay. The final 1920s landmark horror film I'll discuss is Haxan, Witchcraft Through the Ages. The film was produced in Sweden in 1922 by Danish director Benjamin Christensen. It was a dramatized documentary with fantasy sequences, featuring, among other things, Satan and several witchcraft rituals. It was easily one of the most notorious horror films of the era, and it tested the boundaries of good taste. Haxan also featured an effective jump scare 3 years before Phantom of the Opera did. Thematically, Haxan was, according to film historian Ado Kuriu, an indictment of the criminal church, its inquisitions, and its instruments of torture. But what is the church but an organization created and led by men? Doesn't this mean that Haxan, as well, is a horror film that deals with the evil of man, instead of the evil of some monster or some devil? And with that, I rest my case. Man is the monster in 1920s horror cinema. My name is Wolfcraft. You've been watching History of Horror. If you liked this episode, I'd sure appreciate you subscribing to my channel and also giving a like to this episode. Join me next time for History of Horror episode 10, The Mummy, from Carter and Carnarvon to Tom Cruise. I'm also an author. My science fiction novel God of Desolation is available on Amazon. Check it out. Thanks aplenty.